Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Collapse. The first thing Rescue Director Halvek Norr learned about Deepwell Colony was that a city could fail without becoming chaotic. That almost made the disaster worse, because orderly suffering gave everyone time to understand exactly how large the problem was. Deepwell lay beneath 300 meters of rock on a world whose surface cold could kill unprotected life in minutes. The colony had been built underground because underground was safer. Generations of engineers had designed pressure doors, segmented transit tunnels, emergency supports, isolated power grids, and redundant ventilation around that assumption. Normally, they had been right. Then a buried fracture line moved. It was not the mapped fault the colony had monitored for 62 years. It was an older break, hidden beneath layers of volcanic stone and assumed stable by every survey Deepwell possessed. When it shifted, one part of the underground city moved sideways by nearly 2 meters. The colony's safety systems did what they had been built to do. Pressure doors sealed, power isolated damaged branches, emergency supports caught loads that would otherwise have crushed whole districts. Tens of thousands survived because engineers long dead had imagined bad days in advance. They simply had not imagined this exact bad day. Residential Sector 12 folded inward. 3 habitation levels partially collapsed. A transit concourse dropped into the maintenance deck below it. 2 structural galleries pancaked, and rockfall sealed the eastern rescue routes. Halvek reached command 43 minutes after the main shock. He was 56 years old by Cauldron reckoning and had spent 31 of those years in rescue work. He had begun as a structural medic, the kind of specialist who crawled behind shoring teams and kept crushed people alive while engineers argued with gravity. Later came section command, then regional disasters, then the director's insignia he had never particularly wanted. People assumed experience made disasters easier. It did not. Experience merely taught you which mistakes would kill rescuers as well as victims. His deputy, Tervas, met him at the operations table with dust across his uniform and 3 live casualty maps open at once. Halvek did not ask whether the numbers were final. Numbers were never final during the first hours of a collapse. Live signals. He asked, Tervas told him they had hundreds in accessible zones and several hundred more unconfirmed deeper in the damaged district. Structural movement was continuing, the western approaches were passable, and Gallery 3 still offered the shortest route into Sector 12. Halvek studied the displacement plot for Gallery 3 for less than 5 seconds. Close it, Tervas hesitated. It shortens access by 40%, and the ceiling is still moving. Close it. The order went out. Halvek had once watched a rescue team die because a commander treated a dangerous shortcut as a calculated risk. It had taken 17 minutes for the second collapse to bury 6 rescuers beside the people they had been trying to reach. 22 years later, Halvek could still remember the names without checking the memorial. He opened a channel to structural control. Give me the safest route to every confirmed live signal. No one enters an unsupported void. If the structure changes, the route changes. I don't care how close we are. Teams moved. Medics established triage. Remote crawlers disappeared into spaces too small for personnel. Bore crews prepared microdrills. Listening stations spread across the collapse zone. Deepwell had trained for cave-ins, and the preparation showed. Then the humans arrived. Halvek knew Terran urban search and rescue teams by reputation. Humans had earthquakes, mines, industrial collapses, cyclones, landslides, explosions, and an apparently inexhaustible talent for putting cities in places where nature objected. He had never worked beside one of their teams. The Terran contingent came through Gallery 7 carrying acoustic arrays, fiber scopes, compact shoring, medical packs, inflatable void supports, coils of cable, and enough coffee to make Halvek wonder whether their logistics officer had misunderstood the mission duration. Their chief introduced herself while walking. Elowen Grant. She was a broad-shouldered human in her late 40s, with gray beginning at her temples and the compact economy of movement Halvek associated with people who had spent years working in protective gear. A faded scar crossed one knuckle. Dust was already streaked across one cheek. Halvek gave his own name and pointed toward the command map. You are assigned to acoustic search and void access under local structural authority. You will not enter zones marked red without clearance. Good, Elowen said. That answer pleased him more than she could have known. Visiting teams often arrived eager to prove themselves. Elowen seemed more interested in learning what might kill her people. She studied the map. Where are your confirmed survivors? Halvek showed her. Her eyes moved across the marked signals, the open access routes, and the collapsed spaces between them. Then she asked, "Where are the unconfirmed ones?" Halvek looked at her. Alowan tapped the blank regions of Sector 12. "That's where we start listening." They did. For the next 18 hours, Deepwell gave people back. A child survived behind a fallen partition. 3 maintenance workers were trapped beneath a transit slab. An elderly pair waited in a service corridor with 1 broken emergency light and enough air for days. A family survived because the walls of their bathing room folded into a triangular void instead of crushing flat. Cauldron crawlers found some. Human microphones found others. Deepwell engineers kept the access routes safe enough to reach them. Human medics worked beside local medics. Nobody owned the rescues, and Halvek preferred it that way. Near the end of the first day, he found Alowan arguing with one of her own specialists beside a narrow void. The man wanted to enter. Alowan pointed to the displacement sensors and told him the surrounding slab was still moving. "We've got a signal," he insisted. "We've got a possible signal," Alowan corrected. "And if you crawl in there before shoring catches up, we may have 3 signals." The rescuer clenched his jaw. Alowan did not raise her voice. "We are here to reduce the body count, Joss. We do not join it." He looked at the sensors, then nodded. They sent a crawler instead. 10 minutes later, its camera found 2 survivors. Halvek watched the feed and remembered Alowan's sentence. He would remember it again 6 days later when continuing the search became harder than stopping. Chapter 2. The Golden Hours. The first 2 days passed in noise. Drills cut access holes. Shoring hammers rang through the damaged district. Loaders moved fractured stone. Medical teams called for plasma, splints, oxygen, and transport. Every rescue produced another problem. A void could be reached but not safely widened. A survivor could answer but not move. A pocket contained breathable air but rising carbon dioxide, or a direct route crossed structure that no engineer trusted. Halvek barely slept. That was not heroism. It was poor scheduling during the first operational cycle, and by the second evening Tervas had ordered a cot placed behind the command station. Halvek resented the implication and used it anyway. The human team irritated him in several new ways. The first was silence. Every few hours, Alowan requested a temporary mechanical shutdown over one part of the collapse. Drills stopped. Loaders stopped. In selected galleries, even ventilation flow was reduced for a few minutes. Halvek disliked it at first. Machines that were not working were not clearing rubble. Alowan's answer was simple. "Machines are loud, survivors aren't always." On the second morning, he authorized a 7-minute listening window over Grid 12C. The colony changed when the machinery stopped. Deepwell was never truly silent. Rock creaked under shifting load. Distant systems hummed. Air whispered through damaged ducts. Water ticked somewhere inside a fractured wall. Search technicians pressed headphones tighter. 1 minute passed, then 2, and then 3. A human technician raised a hand. "Possible impact east side, weak." They shifted sensors and listened again. Halvek heard nothing. The technician reported 3 irregular impacts. "Could be settling," Halvek said. "Could be," Alowan agreed. She picked up a steel probe, struck the floor twice, waited, and then struck it once. Everyone listened. At first, there was only the colony. Then something answered from beneath them, 2 faint impacts, a pause, and 1 more. Halvek felt the hair along his forearms rise. 7 hours later, they pulled a young surveyor through an access shaft barely wider than his shoulders. The survivor had a broken leg, severe dehydration, and a smile Halvek would remember for years. After that, Halvek never objected to the listening windows. Not every silence produced a person. Most did not. Some sounds were pipes, settling stone, dripping water, damaged ventilation veins, or machinery transmitting vibration through hundreds of meters of structure. Enough were human beings, or cauldron, or avori, or any of the other species living at Deepwell that nobody called the shutdowns wasted time. Alowan also irritated Halvek by sleeping. More accurately, she irritated him by making everyone else sleep. On the 3rd night, Halvek found one of her acoustic specialists arguing to remain on station after 14 hours underground. "I can still work," the man said. Alowan shook her head. "You can still stand. That's not the same thing. You missed the last 2 call signs on the radio and wrote the wrong grid number once. I don't want to quit while people are down there. You're not quitting, you're sleeping so you don't invent a survivor out of conduit noise tomorrow." The man looked miserable. Alowan softened slightly. "Hope is not a substitute for attention. Go sleep." He went. Halvek approved because exhaustion had killed almost as reliably as unstable concrete during his career. Later, over coffee that smelled strong enough to strip protective coating, he asked Alowan how long she had been doing this. Alowan told him she had been doing rescue work for 27 years. beginning in the fire service before moving into technical rescue. Buildings, mines, transit tunnels, and whatever else fell down on somebody. When Halvek asked whether the coffee had come with the profession, she said it had. He observed that caffeine appeared medically significant to humans. Only emotionally, Eloin replied. He could not tell if she was joking. By the end of the third day, the rescue count had climbed, so had the dead. The first body recoveries began in zones where no viable void remained. Halvek signed those transitions himself. He had learned long ago never to make a junior officer carry a decision the director was paid to own. No one liked the change. No one argued, not yet. Chapter 3. The Curve. By day 4, rescue became mathematics. Halvek hated that phrase, but every major disaster eventually reduced part of itself to air, water, temperature, injury, void, volume, structural risk, and time. The longer a person remained trapped, the worse most probabilities became. Deepwell's underground temperature was relatively forgiving because the rock retained heat. Air was harder. Water was harder still. Ruptured plumbing might drown one void and save another. A cracked coolant pipe might provide condensation. A sealed apartment might keep out dust while slowly filling with carbon dioxide. Models helped. Models also lied by omission. Halvek knew the difference because he had spent a career reading both models and bodies. By the 5th day, confirmed live signals had nearly stopped. One maintenance worker survived because a storage cabinet had held a slab several centimeters above his chest. Another was found in a utility room where condensation from a cooling pipe had given her enough water to remain conscious. Those survivors were exceptions. Halvek knew it. Eloin knew it. Neither pretended otherwise. Near dawn, Halvek found her sitting on a crate with coffee in one hand and 3 old structural records open on a tablet. "Your shift ended an hour ago," he said. Without looking up, she answered, "I know." "Then why are you here?" "Because this map is wrong." That got his attention. Eloin clarified before he could object. The map was not wrong in its current geometry. It was missing an old reinforcement schedule. 6 years earlier, a machine room beneath Sector 12 had been upgraded for heavier industrial equipment. The work order existed in facilities records, but had never migrated into the disaster planning structural model. Halvek called structural control. The engineers added the reinforcement. One predicted survivable void disappeared. Another became possible. Eloin handed back the tablet and stood. "Now I'm going to sleep." Halvek blinked. "You are?" She frowned at him. "Yes. Jaws has my section. If I can't trust him while I'm asleep, I shouldn't have made him a team lead." Then she left. Halvek watched her go and thought about command. He had met rescuers who treated exhaustion as proof of devotion. Humans clearly produced those people too, because Eloin spent a surprising amount of time sending them to bed. She was not sentimental about work. She was sentimental, if that was even the right word, about keeping people capable of doing it. Later that afternoon, Tervas found Halvek still at the command table. "Director, when did you last sleep?" Halvek did not look up. "This conversation is inappropriate between ranks." 9 hours, 10. Very inappropriate." Tervas slid a ration bar beside his hand. "Chief Grant says leaders who become stupid from fatigue are still stupid." Halvek looked toward the human staging area. Eloin, now awake, lifted her coffee at him in silent accusation. Halvek ate the ration bar. The exchange became important the next morning, because on day 6, he had to make the decision every rescue director eventually feared. He had to end the live rescue phase. Chapter 4. Recovery. Halvek made the decision at 06:20. He delayed it once, then forced himself to review the evidence without bargaining with it. There had been no verified live signal for 31 hours. No successful extraction had occurred in almost 2 days. Several deep zones had modeled air conditions below survivability. 2 secondary structural shifts had occurred overnight, and 1 rescue crew had nearly been buried when a fractured support rotated under load. The probability of another rescue was approaching 0. The risk was not. Halvek gathered the section leaders at 0700. Eloin stood near the back with Joss and the human structural specialist Ren Marlowe. Her face revealed nothing. Halvek spoke plainly. "Effective 0800, Deepwell transitions from active rescue to controlled recovery in unresolved deep collapse zones. Hazardous tunneling stops unless required by confirmed life signs. Structural monitoring continues. Recovery access proceeds under reduced exposure standards." No one moved. An alien medic looked down. Abort team chief closed her eyes. Halvek continued because someone had to finish the sentence. "We have searched every verified survivability pocket currently identified in the model. We have no confirmed acoustic, thermal, respiratory, or motion evidence of life in the unresolved zones. Continuing the same search profile now risks adding rescuers to the casualty count without credible evidence of survivability. His voice nearly failed. He kept it steady. This is not abandonment. It is a change in operational phase. Silence held the room. Then Aloan raised a hand, not challenging, requesting recognition. Halvek nodded. Chief Grant, when you say hazardous tunneling stops, what happens to passive search? He frowned. Clarify. Listening stations, microbores from green zones, air sampling, crawlers, structural record review, anything that keeps searching without putting a body into unstable space. Several heads turned toward her. Halvek had expected anger from somebody. He had expected a rescuer to insist that hope justified one more tunnel. Aloan was asking about equipment schedules. Recovery operations retain remote systems, he said. For recovery tasking, Aloan replied. I'm asking whether they can retain live search tasking where plausible voids remain uncleared. We have no credible survivor predictions there. Predicted or possible. Halvek felt the old ache behind his ribs. Eventually, that distinction stops being operationally useful. Aloan looked toward the buried district on the map, not to the person in the void. Changed. It was not accusation. That would have been easier. It was the question Halvek had already been asking himself. He kept his voice level. I will not authorize personnel exposure for speculative search. Neither will I. That surprised him. Aloan stepped closer to the table. I'm not asking to put people in red zones. I'm asking to keep listening from green ones. If we find something, then we reassess. If we don't, nobody gets buried, proving how committed we are. For how long? As long as plausible voids remain uncleared and the search itself stays low risk. Halvek studied her. You believe people are still alive. I believe I don't know. That is not enough to risk a rescue team. Agreed. She pointed toward the acoustic gear. Is it enough to risk a microphone? Halvek looked to structural control. The lead engineer confirmed that passive listening from shored galleries added negligible exposure. Microbores could be drilled from safe positions where geometry permitted. Crawlers were machines. Losing one would be expensive, not tragic. Halvek's doctrine did not forbid extended passive search. It simply did not require it. He looked back at Aloan. No unauthorized entry, no hand excavation in unstable zones. Structural control says stop, you stop. Shift limits remain in force. Aloan nodded after each condition. Agreed. Then passive live search may continue. She answered with a single, quiet, thank you, then returned to her team. Halvek followed a few minutes later. Humans were gathered around a folding table while Aloan updated their rotation board. Hazardous tunneling is done unless we get a confirmed signal, she told them. Listening continues. Bore team stays available. Crawlers keep mapping. Nobody freelances. Nobody decides they're too dedicated to sleep. One rescuer lifted an empty metal coffee container. How long are we doing this? Aloan looked at the container first. Until command ends passive search or we clear the remaining plausible voids. The rescuer shook the empty pot. More immediate problem. For the first time that morning, Aloan's expression changed. We're out. Completely. Well, that's an actual emergency. A few people laughed. Briefly, it was enough. Aloan pointed at the board. Night shift sleeps, day shift eats before stations. Somebody acquire coffee through legitimate logistics channels before Joss starts drinking machine coolant. I heard that, Joss said. It was intended to be heard. Halvek stood outside the work area and watched them. The humans had just been told the probability of finding another survivor was nearly gone. Their response was not a speech about never giving up. They scheduled rest, reassigned sensors, and requested more coffee. Halvek was beginning to understand them. Chapter 5. Because it happened. The 7th day was worse than the 6th. On day 6, the transition itself had produced work. On day 7, there was mostly silence. Recovery teams opened other sections of the collapse. Bodies came out. Families waited in identification areas. Human acoustic specialists sat above the deepest unresolved zones wearing headphones while machinery shut down for listening windows. Nothing answered. At midday, one geophone detected a repeating metallic pulse. The operator's face changed. Aloan arrived immediately, so did Halvek. They stopped nearby machinery and repeated the listening interval. The sound came at regular spacing, a faint impact, a pause, another impact, another pause. Hope rose in Halvek before he could stop it. Then a structural engineer traced the vibration to a damaged conduit expanding and contracting against a slab as its temperature changed. No survivor. The human operator removed his headphones. His hands trembled. Aloan touched his shoulder. Log it. He looked at her as if the instruction were insufficient. I thought it was somebody. So did I, she said. Log it anyway, then we move the station. No one pretended disappointment was useful evidence. Later, Halvek found Alowan kneeling beside a bore camera and finally asked the question that had been bothering him since the previous morning. "Why does your doctrine allow this?" She looked up. "Allow what?" Continuing after the normal survival curve has collapsed. "Your people know how rare a rescue is after this long." "Yes, then why build procedure around an exception?" Alowan sat back on her heels. For a moment, Halvek expected something grand. Humans had a reputation for turning stubbornness into philosophy when given an audience. Instead, she said, "Because we've stopped too early before." Halvek waited. Alowan wiped dust from the camera housing. "Earth has earthquakes, mines, building collapses, explosions. People survive in ridiculous little pockets that models say shouldn't be there. Sometimes they have a water line. Sometimes air gets through a crack. Sometimes a refrigerator or a beam holds up a slab." Halvek asked whether people truly survived after this many days. Alowan said some had survived even longer, though she readily admitted it was uncommon. That left him with the obvious question, why build procedure around something so rare? Alowan looked toward Sector 12. "Because it happened, more than once. You don't risk 6 rescuers because one person somewhere once survived for 2 weeks. But if a microphone can keep asking the question from a safe hallway, you let the microphone ask." That was all. No speech about hope. No claim that probability did not matter. The humans had simply collected enough ugly history to know what their models could miss. That evening, Halvek reviewed Terran rescue records. He found earthquake survivors pulled from debris after many days. Mine workers located long after initial projections. People protected by furniture, beams, machinery, collapsed stairwells, and accidents of geometry nobody could have designed deliberately. Some had water. Some had tiny air paths. Some survived because a pipe leaked in exactly the right direction. Rare did not mean imaginary. Halvek closed the file and sat in the command center while Deepwell remained silent. He thought about his own career. Cauldron Doctrine had been built from disasters too. Every red line on a structural map existed because someone had once crossed one and paid for it. Every shoring rule, every air test, every mandatory rest cycle had a body behind it somewhere in history. The humans were doing the same thing. Their extended search was not optimism, it was memory. Chapter 6. The Missing Frame. The clue came from an invoice, not a sensor, not a dramatic tapping sound, not a miracle, a maintenance invoice. Ren Marlowe, the human structural specialist, found it while comparing collapsed geometry against old facility records. He brought the document to Alowan, who read it once and immediately brought it to Halvek. Ren pointed to a reinforcement entry beneath Sector 12. "This machine frame is heavier than the model assumes." Halvek recognized the industrial upgrade Alowan had found earlier, but the invoice contained detail the summary record did not. Additional lateral bracing, higher compression members, and a revised anchoring scheme installed during a later repair. Structural Control rebuilt the local model. The lead engineer stared at the result. "If the frame remained intact during the initial shear," she said, "Level 12B may not have pancaked completely." Halvek leaned over the projection. "Show me." 2 floor slabs rotated in the simulation. One struck the reinforced machine frame and caught instead of settling flat. A wedge-shaped space appeared between them. It was small, deep, irregular, and ugly. It existed. Halvek felt his pulse change. "Can we confirm the frame held?" "Not directly." Alowan asked for a safe listening surface. The engineer identified a reinforced service gallery 20 meters above the predicted pocket. Its structural status remained green. Halvek made the decision before anyone asked. "Move the acoustic team." Nobody celebrated. That impressed him. A possible void was geometry. It was not a survivor. The team installed sensors and stopped nearby recovery machinery. They listened. Nothing. Microphones moved to a second position. Still nothing. Air sampling through an existing fracture showed slightly elevated carbon dioxide. That might mean biological activity. It might also mean damaged waste systems or trapped organic material. A crawler advanced to within 12 meters before rubble stopped it. The camera saw only dust, fractured wall material, and darkness. Alowan studied the model. "Can we microbore from the service gallery?" The structural engineer said yes once they refined the slab position. "Do it," Alowan said. Halvek stopped her with one gesture. "Tomorrow," she turned. "Our bore team is ready. Your bore team has been awake 11 hours. Alowan checked the time and exhaled. "Fair. Sleep," her mouth tightened. "Was that an order?" "Yes." She looked personally offended by receiving her own doctrine back from him. Halvek enjoyed that more than was professionally appropriate. The humans rotated out. 2 hours later, Tervas found Halvek still at the map. The deputy only had to say, "Director." before Halvek answered no. Tervas pointed out that he had not asked anything yet. Halvek replied that his tone had become predictable. Folding both arms, Tervas finally said what they both knew. Halvek's shift had ended. Halvek stared at the possible void on the display. Then he remembered Alowan saying that leaders who were stupid from fatigue were still stupid. "Get me coffee," he said. Tervas stared. "Then wake me in 4 hours," his deputy smiled. Yes, Director, humans, Halvek decided, were contagious. Chapter 7. Day 8. At 05:40 on the 8th day, Deepwell became silent again. Halvek stood inside the reinforced service gallery with Alowan, Wren, and 6 acoustic specialists. The air smelled of dust, old insulation, and metal warmed by work lights. No drills ran, no loaders moved. Even ventilation in the adjacent gallery had been throttled down for the listening window. Sensors covered the floor and walls. A steel probe had been anchored through a narrow bore into fractured structure below, giving sound a cleaner path through the rubble. Alowan raised one hand. Everyone stopped moving. Halvek listened. Rock ticked somewhere far away. A pipe hummed softly. His own clothing seemed offensively loud whenever he breathed. A minute passed, then another. One technician adjusted gain. Another stared at a waveform. Nothing. Alowan checked the clock. 2 more minutes. Nobody argued. A faint disturbance touched one specialist's headphones. The human stiffened. Alowan saw it immediately. What? Maybe an impact, low channel, could be structure. Alowan asked whether the sound had repeated. It had not. They waited anyway, but nothing else came. The specialist finally shook his head. Could have been me. Alowan nodded. Fine. There was no disappointment in her voice, only procedure. She picked up a short striker and tapped the anchored probe twice, waited, then tapped once. The pattern traveled down into the collapse. Halvek listened. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Alowan lowered the striker. One of the technicians shifted, then froze. Wait! Everyone stopped breathing. From somewhere beneath them came a sound so weak Halvek nearly convinced himself he had imagined it. 2 impacts, a pause, 1 impact. No one moved. Alowan's face changed, but not into joy. It became narrower, harder, entirely focused. Again, she said. She struck the probe twice, waited, and struck once. Silence answered. Halvek felt hope begin to collapse inside him. Then the mountain replied. 2, pause, 1. A rescuer made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Alowan snapped toward him. Quiet. The gallery went still again. She repeated the pattern. The answer returned in the same rhythm. This time Halvek heard it clearly. Someone was below them. Someone was alive. 8 days after the collapse, training took over before emotion could. Halvek opened command channels. Structural control, restore live rescue status for 12B medical standby. Bore team to gallery 12. Recovery machinery remains shut down inside the acoustic radius. Tervas, notify command that we have a confirmed responsive signal. The gallery came alive without becoming chaotic. Alowan was already marking coordinates. Halvek looked at her. How certain? Certain enough to drill. That was enough. The argument about whether anyone remained alive was over. The harder problem had begun. Chapter 8. The Eye. They did not tunnel directly toward the signal. That would have been faster. It also might have killed whoever had just answered. Structural analysis showed the predicted void trapped beneath 2 slabs leaning against the reinforced machine frame. Remove load in the wrong place and the entire pocket could collapse. So they drilled small. The microbore was no wider than Halvek's wrist. The crew advanced centimeters at a time while displacement sensors watched the slabs. Nothing shifted. Halvek hated the pace. Alowan clearly hated it too. Neither told the crew to go faster. 3 hours later, the drill broke through. Pressure changed slightly. Air sampling began immediately. Oxygen was low but survivable. Carbon dioxide was high. Moisture was present. A technician studied the result. Something has been breathing in there. Halvek closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them. Camera. A fiber optic lens slid down the bore. The monitor showed darkness, suspended dust, a fractured wall, and part of a service conduit. Then something moved. The operator steadied the camera. A face appeared. One eye opened and stared directly into the lens. For several seconds, Halvek forgot every command phrase he had ever learned. The trapped person moved her mouth. No sound came through. Alowan pointed to the bore. Audio line. A thin comm cable followed the camera. Static filled the speaker. Then breathing. Then a voice weak enough that everyone leaned closer despite knowing the speaker volume would not improve. Hello. Every person in the gallery froze. Halvek leaned toward the microphone. This is Rescue Director Halvek Norr. We hear you. The answer came several seconds later. There are 4 of us. Halvek looked at Alowan. 4, not 1. Halvek asked the speaker to identify herself. She was Vesra Pellin, a maintenance technician assigned to the machine room when the collapse began. We're under the frame, she said. Her voice shook. It held. Halvek asked about injuries. Two could move. One colonist had a crushed arm, another had severe leg injuries, and the fourth drifted in and out of consciousness. Medical officers fed Halvek questions while engineers prepared support lines. Halvek asked about water first. A faint laugh came through the speaker as Vesra told him a pipe was leaking into the pocket. They had no food, and when he asked about the air, her answer was simply that it was bad. "We are sending supplemental air now," Halvek told her. A narrow line went through the bore. Clean air began flowing into the void. Another tube followed with water and electrolyte solution formulated for the trapped species. Vesra told them how the four had survived. The reinforced frame had held just enough. A potable water line had cracked on the first day. Vesra had shut down an arcing electrical junction before it could ignite debris. They had blocked a waste leak with torn insulation and clothing. They rationed movement because breathing harder made the air worse, and they had tapped on pipes. Again and again whenever they heard machinery above them. No one answered, Vesra whispered. Halvek looked toward Aloan. The human chief did not look triumphant. She looked furious at the universe. The drills had been too loud. The loaders had been too loud. For days, 4 living people had been knocking beneath a rescue operation that could not hear them. Aloan said quietly, "Tell them we're here." Halvek almost answered that Vesra obviously knew. Then he understood what Aloan meant. He leaned toward the microphone. "Vesra, listen to me. We are here. We know where you are. We are not leaving." A long silence followed. Then Vesra answered with one word. "Good." Chapter 9. The tunnel. It took 14 more hours to reach them. That was the cruelest part. Once life had been confirmed, every instinct demanded speed. Confirmation did not make the rubble safer. The access route required a narrow side tunnel through fractured structural material. Shoring went in piece by piece. Rock came out in controlled sections. Sensors watched the slabs continuously. Medical staff monitored the survivors through the bore. One of the 4 began deteriorating. Blood pressure fell. Breathing became shallow. Halvek stood over the access model and asked the structural engineer whether they could accelerate. She shook her head. "Not without increasing collapse probability." Halvek looked at Aloan, and her answer was immediate no. He almost smiled at how quickly she agreed after spending 2 days arguing to continue the search. Aloan stared back at him. "Searching and gambling are not the same thing." Halvek nodded. That was exactly the answer he wanted. They worked. They waited. At one point, a slab shifted 3 millimeters. Everyone evacuated the access tunnel. Halvek felt physically ill while the displacement graph settled. The void remained intact. They went back in. Hours later, the tunnel finally opened into the maintenance pocket. The first rescuer crawled through, followed by medics. Vesra Pellin had kept the other 3 alive for 8 days. She had 2 broken fingers and a badly injured leg. She apologized because she could not walk out. Human medic treating her stared for a moment and said, "You've done enough. Let us do something now." The first survivor came through on a stretcher. Nobody cheered. Medical teams moved immediately. Then the second. The third was unconscious and went straight toward critical care. Finally, Vesra emerged. Her face was gray with dust. Her eyes were sunken, her hair matted, and her injured leg immobilized in a field splint. She was alive. The entire gallery seemed to exhale. Aloan leaned against the wall. Joss appeared beside her and handed over a cup of coffee. She took it automatically. Halvek looked at the cup, then at her. "You asked for more coffee." Aloan drank. "Needed more coffee." "That was 2 days ago." "Still true," Halvek laughed. It arrived without permission and became impossible to stop. Aloan looked at him as though the rescue director had finally suffered a stress injury. Perhaps he had. Vesra's stretcher disappeared toward medical. 4 survivors. Day 9. Halvek remained in the gallery after the teams moved on. The rescue had not succeeded because the humans ignored danger. They had accepted the end of dangerous searching. They had simply refused to confuse too dangerous to dig with nothing safe remains to be done. A recovery operation had become a rescue operation because somebody kept listening. That fact required very little interpretation. Chapter 10. Almost. 3 days later, Vesra Pellin was awake in the medical ward. All 4 survivors lived. One remained critical and the others faced long recoveries, but none had become another name on Deepwell's memorial list. Halvek visited once. Vesra recognized his voice before she fully recognized his face. "You were the one on the microphone." "Yes." She looked toward the ward window. "How long were we down there?" 9 days before extraction." Vesra closed her eyes. "We thought you stopped looking." Halvek had spent 3 decades learning how to speak to survivors and families. None of the practiced sentences fit, so he told the truth. "We did stop the active search." Her eyes opened. "Then how did you hear us?" "The humans asked to keep the passive search running. Listening equipment bore sampling, crawlers, records, review, things that didn't require putting another rescuer under unstable structure." Vesra thought about that. Then she nodded, no speech, no revelation, just understanding. Later, Halvek found Aloan packing acoustic equipment. Her team was preparing to leave Deepwell. He stood beside her while she coiled cable. "I have a question. That sounds dangerous. At what point would you have stopped?" Aloan continued working. "When it wasn't safe to keep searching, or when we'd cleared every place somebody could plausibly still be alive. We had already reached the first condition for personnel entry. Right, so we changed how we searched. Even if the probability had become almost zero." Aloan stopped coiling the cable. She looked at him. "Almost." Halvek said nothing. Aloan returned to the cable. That was enough. Epilogue. Doctrine. 6 months later, Halvek stood inside a regional rescue training complex while a class of young officers worked through a simulated structural collapse. Deepwell had changed doctrine, not dramatically. Halvek considered that important. The lesson was not that rescuers should crawl into suicidal spaces because somebody might be alive. Deepwell had proved the opposite several times. Aloan herself had stopped her own people from entering unstable voids, and Halvek had ended hazardous tunneling when the evidence no longer justified it. The revision added one phase between active rescue and recovery: extended survivability search. The procedure required remote acoustic monitoring, microbores where safely possible, air sampling, structural record reassessment, low-risk crawlers, and strict crew rotation limits. Continued only while plausible voids remained uncleared, and only while the search methods themselves remained acceptably safe. It was less dramatic than a heroic last stand. Halvek trusted it more for that reason. A young officer studying the simulation raised one hand and reported that projected survivability had fallen below the normal active rescue threshold. Halvek agreed. The officer then asked whether that meant they should terminate the live search. Halvek looked at the simulated collapse map. One maintenance pocket remained unverified. "Have we listened there?" he asked. The officer checked. "No. Then hazardous entry may be finished, but the search is not." The officer nodded and began retasking acoustic equipment. Across the training floor, a visiting human rescuer lifted an empty coffee container. "Director, we're also out." Halvek looked at the container, then at the young officer. "Correct both problems." The class moved. So did the coffee.